So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion of The Last Secret of the Secret Annex. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you can, you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust from photographer Martin Scholler. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Bep Voskuijl. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Jeroen de Bruin, and Pamela Nadel. Joop is the third of Bep Voskuijl's 4 children. He was born in 1949 in Amsterdam. After a successful career as a video producer, creating corporate movies for major Dutch companies, and marketing manager for newspapers such as NRC Handelsblad and Algemeen Dagblad, Joop retired in 2010 to pursue research and writing with the goal of telling his mother's story. He also volunteers as a guest lecturer, teaching Dutch school children and other groups about Anne Frank, the Holocaust, and the resistance during World War II. Jeroen was born in 1993 in Antwerp. At age 15, the same age as Anne when she died of typhus in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Jeroen began doing original research on the secret annex. He got to know the Anne Frank house firsthand during an internship there in 2011. He went on to study journalism, subsequently contributing to prominent Flemish news magazines like Knack and Jude's Actueel, and working as a senior educator for the major Belgian newspaper Gazette van Antwerpen. Pamela holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest award, Scholar/Teacher of the Year. Her recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year and appeared in a Hebrew translation. A past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, her consulting work for museums includes the Museum and Memorial Plan for Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue. She is currently writing a book about the history of American anti-Semitism to be published in 2025 by W.W. Norton. You can buy The Last Secret of the Secret Annex at the link in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Pamela.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sydney. And what a privilege to be here to talk about this extraordinary book, The Last Secret of the Secret Annex, and to spend some time with the authors. This book is, it's kind of multiple narratives, because on the one hand, it raises the question, it's a mystery. It asks the question about who might have betrayed the Franks family. On the other hand, it's a book about how Holocaust trauma rippled across the generations. And it also gives us an insight into what was going on in Amsterdam during World War II. For those of us who have only read The Diary of Anne Frank, our knowledge of that world is really circumscribed by the walls of the Annex, and we don't know as much about what life was like outside. So I'd like to start by asking Jeroen, who was 15 when he went and met Joop, if he could tell us a little bit about how they came to write this book together.
Thanks, Pamela. Well, like millions of children, I was quite early on fascinated by the Anne Frank story and by the Holocaust. But Anne Frank's story in particular triggered my interest, and I've always been fascinated by the helpers too. As the protectors are called in the diary in Dutch. So, you know, it was funny in some way because, you know, on one hand, I knew that, you know, a biography had been written about Victor Kugler, one of the other helpers, and Mee Pease had written her own memoir in the 80s. So Bep was always the least known of the helpers and a sort of mysterious character in the Anne Frank story. But on the other hand, there was a scholarly edition of the diary, which is the version that contains everything Anne Frank wrote, so not the popular version, which is known as the Diary of a Young Girl. So in that complete edition, I read, you know, very long passages Anne Frank wrote about Bep, about their friendship, about whatever Bep brought to the secret annex, and how she would be there always at noon to have lunch with the people together. So it was clear that a certain bond had developed between the two of them, but I couldn't quite understand at the time why she was the least known of them all. But I came up with the idea to write a book about her. And I decided to get in touch with her children. You know, I read on the internet that she had 4 children, one of them named after Anne Frank. And the Anne Frank house passed along a letter I wrote. And, you know, in a matter of days, I received a reply from Joop, who wrote that he was, you know, struck by, you know, by my sincere desire to, you know, to understand his mother. And he also said that he was, you know, that him and his siblings had a sort of agreement not to discuss the past. But he also told me that he was willing or inclined to perhaps reconsider that and perhaps maybe write a book as I suggested. And so we met up and the rest is history, as they say.
Perhaps I can add something.
Sure.
Yes. When we got the letter, me and my wife were so surprised. It was amazing what he was telling us there. For instance, he told me things about my grandfather, which I really didn't know. And I was very interested in his way of doing research. He was such a young boy, 15 years old. And he asked for the permission to write a biography of my mother. And that was rather a question because it was an unspoken agreement in the family that we didn't talk about the war. That's what my parents didn't want, explicitly didn't want. But they were already gone, and well, it was, in my opinion, important to tell the story because it's history. And so we decided to go to Vlaanderen, Antwerpen, where Jeroen lived, and we met him. And then I was there about 2.5 hours, and he wanted to ask me about 30 questions. All sorts of books were on the table, and we were so surprised. Of course, we talked about 5 or 6 questions, and I gave them as good as possible my answers. And we got back, and my wife and I said, well, this is what we are going to do. We are going to ask our family to break the silence. I don't know if I say that in the right way, but we didn't want, yes, okay, let us break the silence. And we agreed together, and so it started.
Of course, I didn't know at the time when I wrote that letter that Joop had been a confidant to his mother, you know, as a child, and that she had confided many stories about the secret annex in him, stories that, you know, nobody else knew because they were firsthand. They were from, you know, Bep experienced them herself. So was very fascinating for me to learn all the things that Joop had heard and which we could use for the book, of course.
And Jeroen, I didn't know at that moment what I know now. So we did research. I think we did a good job to research. There were questions while we were writing. So we got many of those answers. So I know now more, and I understand much more about my family, about my mother, about my father, about their relationship, about my family and the aunts. I know what kind of problems there were, and that is because he wrote us a letter.
It's amazing.
It's
how one spark leads you on what was clearly, because Jeroen is no longer 15, was clearly a journey that took over many years to uncover the full story. So I'd like to actually go back a little bit and talk about the family that Joop, that your mother grew up in, because one of the things that you mentioned was that that Jeroen had a question about your grandfather, your mother's father. And of course, you tell us that Johan, your grandfather, was the one who built the bookcase that enclosed the entrance to the secret annex. So I'd like to know something about the family that she grew up in. Can you tell us a little bit about that family?
Yes.
Jeroen can fill in some of the gaps as well.
Well, my grandfather, he was the warehouse manager of Opekta. And Opekta was the company of the family Frank, of Otto Frank. And he worked there as a warehouse manager. And while he was working there, the hiding was starting. And after about 3 weeks, he got the question of Mr. Kleiman, that is also one of the helpers. He was the manager there. And he asked them, do you want to build, can you think about something to conceal the entrance? And then another manager, Victor Kleiman, Victor Kugler, he came with the idea to build a revolving bookcase. And that is what he did. He built the revolving bookcase at his own place. So at the Lumeestraat in Amsterdam. And there was also an attic. And in a very secret way, he went always about 3 weeks. He went upstairs to the attic and he was constructing that bookcase. And it's for me remarkable in that time to build a bookcase. And after he built that bookcase, he took the pieces together, and in about 3 or 4 days, we don't know exactly, he brought it to the Opekta office. And there he assembled the revolving bookcase.
It is probably other than the tree that doesn't exist any longer, the best known of the objects in the secret annex. It's the one that you always think about. And I've had the privilege of visiting the Anne Frank house and passing through that. And so he created something that ended up becoming an iconic symbol of what we think of when we think of the Holocaust. So Jeroen, you mentioned earlier, and it's clear in the book that Bep, who of course is the youngest of the 5 helpers, and who's only, I think, 23 during the time that this is going on, and she developed a very special relationship with Anne Frank, which I don't think we ever really understood until this book. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, like I said in the diary, it's clear that they had a special bond together. I think Joop thinks that too, that it was, it had something to do with the fact that Bep had many little sisters. So she was actually used to caring for all those little girls in the Lumestraat home. So, and she also had the feeling, I think, that she needed to be some kind of a sister to Anne to, you know, help her in the terrible circumstances that she was in, although she was very optimistic, basically. And in the end, it became sort of, Anne did the same thing to Bep in the end, although she was 10 years younger. Bep told after the war that she was, that she felt that Anne was almost motherly toward her, and was always there with eau de cologne when she was feeling, desperate one time in the Annex, those little things. Bep also bought the paper that Anne Frank rewrote her diary on. So from the office supplies she took, but she also bought paper and other things she could write on. So it was a very, very special bond between the two of them. And, we're very happy that we've been able to tell that story because it was very little known indeed.
And also, she even stays over one night in the Annex to spend time with Anne.
Yes, yes.
Yo.
I can add a little thing to the story of my dearest Jeroen. It is a fact that my mother had a very good bond with Anne, and it has everything to do with that they shared nearly everything. It was 10 years between, but they shared at the same moment that they were in love, for instance. They were in love with the man, and they talked about it. And a very special talent of my mother was that she was able to calm down the hiders. She was every afternoon, she was about two hours in the secret annex. So the people trusted her. Of course, they trusted her, but told her all sorts of things. And when there were troubles or there was a little fight, not a fight, but the arguments with each other, then it was sometimes so that Anne, that is a very, how do you call it in? I don't know the name, but a very spirited girl, and then my mother had the ability to calm her down, or to go to her room where she was weeping or crying because she got a loud word of Otto. And then they danced and laughed and joked, and they came again laughing out of the room. So that is what I want to say in relation to the bond between my mother and Anne.
Right. I mean, you describe it, both of you, so beautifully. And it also reminds us of how awful it was for a teenager, and of course, everyone in the Annex, to be locked up for almost 2 years and never see the light of day and have such a limited contact with the world. So, Jeroen, you mentioned something that I'm not sure everybody who's watching understands. You mentioned that Bep brought Anne the paper to rewrite the diary. Could you just tell us a little bit about that? I know it's not the main focus of the book, but I think it's really important because I think most readers will not know this fact.
Certainly, yeah. Well, Anne Frank started writing in her diary a few weeks before the hiding started. And she was 13 when she started writing. In the beginning, it was, she really liked writing, but it wasn't more than a little hobby of hers, so to speak. So gradually, as the hiding went on, and she really started to confide in the diary, you know, and you know, it was her way of coping with the terrible situation she was in. And then in 1944, in May 44, a few months actually before the arrest and the betrayal occurred, she heard in the Annex on the British radio that after the war, you know, that diaries and all that would be collected after the war to, you know, so people could get a picture of what hiding had been like. So she was really enthusiastic about that and decided to rewrite her story, her diary, as a book. And it's unbelievable, but in the, you know, in a matter of months, she was able to rewrite a large part of her diary. You know, she had kept for almost 2 years at that point. So that version was written on the loose papers that Bep gave her from the office supplies, among others. So that's known as the B version of the diary. The A version is the original one. And then there's the C version, which is known to scholars as the version out of Frank compiled based on the two versions, because the B version wasn't actually completed because she, you know, she was arrested, she was betrayed. So she couldn't rewrite everything. And Otto, you know, very cleverly made a sort of a compilation that, you know, included every period of the hiding. And that's, like I said, known as the C version.
Right, that's the version that was originally published, that there was a Hollywood movie made about, there was a Broadway play made about. That's the one that most people know. And then, of course, as scholars began to work on them, we learned so much more. So Jeroen mentioned the betrayal, and Joop, you in the book, you talk about someone who might have betrayed the Franks family. This is actually a member of your family. Nobody really knows who betrayed them. The question of who betrayed the Franks remains ongoing in terms of investigation. People publish books about it. Those books get pulled because they don't like what people, the conclusions that have come out. There was quite an event about that a couple of years ago. But could you tell us one suspicion? You're never able to prove it, but Joop, could you tell us a little bit about who you think might have betrayed the Franks and the people hiding in the secret annex?
Yes, as you say, clearly we can't prove that my Aunt Nelly did the betrayal, but we can, we have much circumstantial evidence, only circumstantial evidence, dus that's no proof. But I want to put my aunt in the context. She was in the beginning of the war. She was 18 years old. That is quite young, and she was a high-spirited girl, and she was fond of everything what was German, and especially uniforms. They loved uniforms. There's a story about her that she fell in love with one of those Germans, and that was an Austrian, I'm sorry, and she went with that Austrian to Austria, and she came back in 1943, and after that she was working for the Germans for about 2 years, and then she went to France, to North France, and there she was working for as a first assistant for a commander on an airbase. And she came back. She begged to come back, I have to say. She begged to come back, to fly back with one of her pilot friends, and she was back in May 1944. So mark my words, that is in any case before the betrayal happened, because that happened on August 4, 1944. And as said, that is when she was in France, that was the family story, and she came back in 1945, then it is impossible that she did it. But we proved, and that proof is in the diary itself, that is very remarkable, that it's in the original papers of Anne, who wrote that down, that she came back in May 1944.
Perhaps I can add that it was, all but the original idea to write anything about the betrayal at all. So what we wanted was to, shed a light on the least known helper. But then after a few years, we discovered that Nelly was, described in the diary, which we didn't know because she had been, those diary passages had been sort of camouflaged in the scholarly edition. Her name was replaced by initials. So we didn't know that she was described in the diary, and we didn't even know that she was working for the Germans. But gradually, as we knew more and found more information about her, we felt like we couldn't leave that out of the book. And it, quite the contrary, it's also been a very important part of Bep's life. Also after the war, certainly during the war, but also after, because she, and that's something that Bep's younger sister confided in us, that Bep actually, suspected her sister of the betrayal, and so did Otto Frank. It must have been devastating for her, of course, to realize that was a possibility. So we really felt like we had to describe all those things, and I must say I really admire Yo, because he was really I can't remember a moment when he was not willing to to face the truth, everything we found about his own family, which was painful sometimes, of course. But it was really open-minded when it came to that. Yeah.
Yes, it was your own, and you know that for sure. It was impossible not to publish what we found about Nelly. It was impossible because that was not honest to the life of my mother. She had a very, very difficult life, not only in the war, but I think in the war better than after the war, because after the war, she had to deal with a sister who was suspected from the betrayal. But not only the betrayal, it is for two sisters. One sister who was a protector of the Jews, and the other sister was collaborating with the enemy. So it was very, very difficult for her to cope with that. And we could feel it in the family. And when I was young, I was 10 until 19, then I was very in an intensively way speaking with my mother. Then there were so many quarrels about the war. And it is said to me, don't speak about the war. My father was angry on me. Don't ask those questions. You see what you are doing with your mother. But I wanted to know.
Well, we are glad that you have done the research to tell us, because what's so striking about your family is that with the portrait of the grandfather and Bep and then Nelly, we get a sense of what were really choiceless choices that the Dutch people made during the occupation. The Germans expected people to work for them, and so in that sense, Nelly did what was expected. And what kind of choice do you make? And then Bep, of course, and Johan make a different choice. But I want to go back to Joop, I want to go back to something that is really a major theme of the book, which is how the trauma of what Bep had lived through, what your mother had lived through with helping the Franks, and then their betrayal, and then their loss, and of course her ongoing friendship with Otto Frank afterwards. But this rippled across her life, and it rippled obviously across your family, because you said we were told not to say anything, not to talk about the war. So one of the reasons we know, or we knew until now, so little about your mother was because of that trauma. Can you talk about it for us? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, of course I will. It is indeed a fact that she didn't want to talk about the war. That has, of course, everything to do with the fact that she knew that my aunt was collaborating. She didn't know if she betrayed, but collaborating was, of course, a fact for her, because they talked about it in the attic. So that is one of the things I have to say. And well, I think my mother's life is a good example of inherited war trauma, because she wasn't able to talk about the war, because then she got emotioned and said she only could talk to of course, Otto Frank and Mipris. They were together, and it was mostly that were letters to each other. And Otto was such a wonderful friend for her, that he was like a father for my mother. My father himself, he couldn't do it, because he was also in the war. He was in Germany, also in the resistance, in his way, of course. But my mother had the problem of her sister, and she was so frustrated and demotivated and traumatized that on one day she I heard her weeping and weeping again, but I couldn't find her. Where was she? I was alone with her on a Friday morning, and she was in the bathroom, and there her mouth was full of pills, full of sleeping pills. And I had to pull it out. So that was rather traumatizing for me too.
And of course, we know from the suicide of the famous writer Primo Levi, the author of Survival in Auschwitz. We know how that trauma and the pain of living with it affected so many people. So we're fortunate that you were able to catch your mother in that moment. But I can scarcely imagine living with that trauma. Let me go back to Jeroen for a moment. So you were 15 years old. You had been researching this. You meet Joop. You've got 30 questions, and obviously you were a historian and journalist in the making as a teenager. But the research that has gone into this book is extraordinary, because as Joop said, he learned so much that he didn't know before. Can you tell us something about your research process? And then also I'd like to hear a little bit about how you both came to write the book together.
Well, we visited a lot of archives, for instance, the National Archives in The Hague, the City Archives in Amsterdam, but also the Anne Frank House. The collections department at the Anne Frank House keeps a lot of correspondence between the helpers and Otto Frank, for instance, from after the war. Now, I should say that correspondence was actually kept by Bep herself, and Joop's siblings donated those letters to the Anne Frank House. We were able to look in those letters, which hadn't been published before or used for any publication before. And what really was striking to me, and Joop didn't know already about that, but it was striking to me to learn that Otto Frank, for instance, actually gave money to Bep after the war, because things were always very tight in her family, and her husband had his own wallpapering company and was sometimes out of job, so it's really hard to make ends meet sometimes. And Otto would help on such occasions. And we found a few letters Bep wrote right after she had received another of that, another amount of that money. And one sentence I remember is that she wrote, "I really do hope to be able one day to repay you for everything you do to me," as if she really didn't realize how infinitely grateful he was to her for whatever she had done. So I thought that was really a good example of her, not only her humbleness, but also the genuine feeling that she had, as if she didn't that what she had done was normal, which it obviously wasn't. So.
Joop, were there like a particular find that startled you in the archives? And also, I think you also said that before she died, your mother burned a lot of her letters. So you only have some of the collection, right?
Yes. A couple of days before she died, she asked my eldest brother to burn. She pointed, of course, where the letters, where the letters were, in what closet, etc. But she asked him to burn letters, and well, he told that to me, and well, I didn't believe him at that time. So I asked him, did you read the letters before you burned them? No, I didn't. It was secret. It was a secret of my mother, so I didn't want to read it. And how many letters were there? I was, of course, interested in those letters because Jeroen and I were looking for letters about my mother and the war and her writings to Otto and to Miep, of course. But we didn't find any letter of Miep, and we did find only, Jeroen knows it better than me, but I think five letters of Otto and a couple of my mother. So the rest of the letters is burned. It's possible that were the letters. We don't know for sure, but he said to me, my eldest brother told me that it were letters about, it were a little bit love letters to the neighbor. Well, that is ridiculous. I don't believe that. Love letters to the neighbor. So.
Yeah, as a historian, and especially of a story that everybody wants to know more about, it is such a loss that those letters were burned, that we have. And then we're lucky that some survived, that you were able to do research in, and that we would have a chance to look at. So one of the things that really jumps out at me about your book, but also about all the books that continue to be published about the Holocaust. There's so many books coming out every year that tell aspects of the history of the Holocaust that we just didn't know. I know the museum had a program earlier with Rebecca Frankel about her book Into the Forest, about a family that literally hid under the ground for 2 years. So I think there's kind of an interesting parallel to the story of the Franks in hiding. And it is astonishing that all these years, all these decades after the war ended, we continue to hear new stories. Yet meanwhile, we also live in a moment where there are people who insist on either denying the Holocaust or distorting it. And I'm wondering if you have hopes for how your book, maybe I'll start with you, Jeroen, hopes for how your book might respond to that.
Well, Joop and I actually had the same feeling, I think, when we were researching. We really felt that it was amazing that all those things were still able to be discovered, 70, 80 years after the war. So what we try with the book, I think, is to not only to, of course, we want to tell Bep's story and Anne's story, and whatever was unknown in the Anne Frank story, we all think we knew so well. But I think we also try to tell, the story of the Holocaust in a wider perspective. I could give the example, for instance, of the Claims Conference in New York, which presented in the beginning of this year the outcome of a survey which they did in Holland among youngsters about millennials and Generation Z youngsters. It turned out, and it's almost not to be believed, but that 1 in 4 of them, nearly 1 in 4, either thought that the Holocaust was a myth or that the figures of the Jews deported to the camps was exaggerated. And even more than half of them didn't even know that the Holocaust happened in Holland as well. So we really do hope to, with our book, to perhaps make a little change to that and tell, especially youngsters, what happened at that time.
Perhaps I can add one little thing. Thank you, Jeroen. You did it. You told it again very good. I want to add that I am the only living person who was close to 5 main persons in the diary, in the diary of Anne Frank. And it is possible via our book to connect all the stories I talked with Miep, with Otto, with my mother, with Nelly, of course. I talked to all those 5 people, and that's why the stories could have been connected to each other. So that is a plus. That is more than the pieces.
And it's what makes the story so powerful, because you made the decision to write this in Joop's voice.
Yes.
I mean, it's really to have the voice of the next generation telling the story. So before I turn to questions from our audience, I just want to share something that your editor said in an interview about the book, which I think is such a perfect testament to this book. And she uses those words. She said that your book is a perfect testament to how the work of history never ends. Every generation gets a chance to look at it again and to take it deeper. And I think that's a wonderful way to now turn to the questions that we come from the audience, so we can hear some of the questions that they have. So I think the first one, which we have not discussed, is what happened to Bep after the Franks were arrested. And you do write about this. So Joop, perhaps you want to start with that one?
Yes, of course I can. She was, of course, troubled, and in the first time she cried a bit, but she got the wallet of Mr. Kleiman, and with that wallet she was gone to the drug store, and there was living a friend of Mr. Kleiman. And in that wallet were secret papers, of course. The Nazis were not allowed to see those papers. And she was perhaps for an hour at that drugstore, and then she left to the city and didn't know what she wanted to do. But at the end, she decided to go to her boyfriend, Bertus Hulsman. Later, it became her fiancé in the war up until 1945. there she told Bertus for the first time that there was an attic, a secret annex. And he didn't know, of course. It was a very, very big secret. And he brought my mother back to her home, the Lumeystraat in Amsterdam, where her father was waiting on her because he was ill. And there she told it to my grandfather. And that was, very, very difficult for him. My Aunt Dini, who is living at this moment, she is 91, and she told the story because she saw that both people were weeping together and were crying, and they were in their arms, etc., etc. So that was quite difficult for both of them. And after about an hour or something like that, my grandfather took the bicycles. He was ill, but he took the bicycles and he went to Prinsengracht 263. And he had the key because he was the ware manager, and he had still the key to enter the office. And he went to the secret annex and to the offices, and he checked everything because the Nazis could have come back. So, and he was very smart in thinking about safety. When he was working there, he had the responsibility of the safety of the hiders. For instance, he had a network with people in the surrounding of the Lumeystraat and in the surrounding of the secret annex, the Prinsengracht, where and he was informed by them, and he informed the other people. So it was a very close network to stay safe. And most of the information was about where are the Germans, where are the Nazis, where they are in about a week. Then he could anticipate. And that was his task. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I thought it was miraculous when I read it that neither of them, neither Johan or your mother, were arrested. As we know, some of the other men who were involved were arrested. Jeroen, one of the questions we came in is somebody's asked, is it possible to read the multiple versions of Anne's diary? I think it's been published, and you can look at it as A, B, and C. Am I right?
Right, yeah. The NIOD Institute in Amsterdam has compiled a complete edition with the 3 versions on the same page. So you can compare actually what the 3 versions were.
Right. That's what I was pretty sure.
It's called The Diaries of Anne Frank. That's the edition.
So a couple of people have asked about, I don't know if you're aware of this, but American television has recently made a series called A Small Light, which I think is about meat geese and rescuing Anne Frank. And they want to know if you've seen it. I haven't, so I can't comment. But if you're aware of it and if you've seen it, because she's really the one that I think has gotten the most attention of the people who helped with the families in the annex.
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm certainly going to. But I've seen some images, and I think it's a great opportunity to show the public what the helpers did. Both Miep and Bep and the others. So yeah, I'm really curious to see what it's like. And
well, I can add you. I have seen 4 episodes.
Oh, good. So tell us.
Of The Small Light, and well, I don't want to tell too much about it, but it is. It's about me. That's all I can say. It's about me. And you don't see anything about the other helpers. It is Miep. And that is, of course, allowed because it is about Miep. But if you are going to look for the history, so what really happened in the secret annex, then you need my mother, and then you need Mr. Kugler, and then you need Mr. Kleinman, and then you need Otto in another way. So that's all I have to say about that. And up until now, 4 episodes.
Perhaps I can add a little thing to that. You know, it's for a long time, it's been a misunderstanding that, you know, Miep was the only one who found the diaries of Anne's. You know, it's for decades, it's been believed that Miep was the one who found the diaries, but it's been both Bep and Miep. And, you know, during our research, we found out that Bep was actually the one who saved the second version, you know, the B version, the rewritten version in the Annex. Different days, you know, they didn't find the diaries together. So it was in several episodes. So I think it's really important to, you know, to stress those facts and to tell the complete story. I didn't expect that it would have been that much story about Miep. I had expected that the others would have come, you know, would have been portrayed too. But it's a pity to hear that that's not true.
Well, I think maybe they were making it before your book came out, because one of the really stunning things about the book is that you really get an appreciation for how all of the helpers had to work together in order to feed the family and take care of them when they were sick. And I think what you know, people who don't know the history of that time period understand is that you couldn't buy all the food to feed all those people in one shop, because then they would know that you were hiding somebody. So you had to go far out. You know, people who were selling you food, you had to have fake coupons to buy them. And you get a sense from the book, especially from the description of Bep, you give us a sense of the strain of that kind of activity, of what it meant that Bep was living, not just when she brought the things to them and was afraid of being, you know, caught there, but was constantly living in fear that maybe somebody would denounce her because she had bought too much food to bring to the annex. So I think we have time maybe for one more question. One that came in alludes to something I talked about before. And there was a book by Rosemary Sullivan, The Betrayal of Anne Frank. It tried to uncover who had who had betrayed the people in the secret annex. It claimed that it was some Jewish official who worked for the Jewish council and who did it to save his own family. And it was so soundly denounced by historians afterwards that it was withdrawn from publication. But I also know that you had been involved with it earlier on. Do you want to say anything, either of you, in closing, just to comment on that?
Yes, I can tell you something about that. I was working with Vince Penkow for about 2 years. And he became a friend, and he is still a friend. So that's not the problem. But there's a problem with that book. I don't want to judge the whole book because I'm not the professional to do that. I'm not the expert to do that. Of course, I think something about it, but I don't want to judge the total book. What I can judge, and I think what I'm allowed to judge, is the part of Nelly. And she is, well, scrubbed out, or how do you call that? Deleted as a suspect. And I really don't agree with that fact, with that fact in the story, because they are, for instance, telling that I'm supposed to be obsessed I'm supposed to be obsessed of finding, via research, of course, the betrayer of the Annex, and that I'm obsessed that it is Nelly. So that is really not true. But what are they saying to prove that I'm obsessed? That I'm already working for 25 years on this subject, and that my Aunt Nelly told that she was aware that I was writing a book. Well, in 1997, when I spoke for 5 or 6 times with my Aunt Nelly after 20 years or something like that, we didn't know about her collaboration. That wasn't known. And we were not thinking about the book. Jeroen came only in 2009, and we learned about the collaboration of my aunt in 2014 for the first time. I was, of course, flabbergasted. But in 1997, it is impossible that my aunt tells that I knew, that she knew about writing a book. So that is not the truth. But they needed that because they wanted to say that I am already for 25 years looking for the betrayer. And then they could say I'm obsessed. So I talked 3 days after the first edition of The Betrayal. I talked with Vince Bangkok. And I had read very quickly, of course, the part about Nelly. And I told him, you know, dear Vince, that is not true. That is, you can say a lie. It is a fabrication, what is written down. And then he said to me, Joop, you're right. Wow. Yes, Joop, you're absolutely right. And I'm going to do something about it. And I was, at that time, I was, of course, happy with that remark of him. He's going to do something about it because, and he wrote it down for me, because he don't want to be mistakes or things what not true in such an important book where his name is connected. He didn't write it, but his name is connected to this book. And it is perhaps a long story, but I had about a month ago and 2 weeks ago, I had again a connection with him via the mail, and I asked him, well, I see the second edition and nothing is changed. It's not only that example I gave, there are more examples of mistakes in the book about Nelly and about me as a person. So he said, yes, I tried, Joe. I'm sorry, I tried, but they don't want to change it.
Well, you've just added to the evidence for why that book is so deeply problematic. So thank you. I want to thank both Jeroen and Joop for this amazing conversation. I urge everyone who's been listening to read the book. You will read it in one sitting as I did. It's just beautifully written and such a powerful story. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sydney Yeager from the museum to close us out.
Thank you so much, Pamela. And I also want to echo what you just said, that I highly encourage everyone to go out and buy this book, which you can do at the link in the chat. And I want to thank all 3 of you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. This was such a fascinating conversation to listen to. I'm I'm so glad that we were able to do this. And I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. And if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events, Next, we have a virtual walking tour of Amsterdam tomorrow, and Transgender People, the Nazi State, and the Holocaust on June 1st. You can watch past programs and view and share today's recording, which is going to be available later this week on our YouTube channel. Thank you again to all three of you. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks so much.